Carl Jung documented a psychological pattern so unsettling that it went far beyond empathy itself. It explored what occurs when the empath finally chooses themselves, and why this act of self-selection either leads to true individuation or exposes the hidden psychological patterns masked by years of endless accommodation. In his studies on individuation and psychological types, Jung identified what I call the self-choice crisis, a phenomenon in which highly sensitive individuals with dominant feeling functions spend years prioritizing others' needs at the expense of their own growth, until they reach a pivotal point where they must decide between ongoing self-abandonment or reclaiming their authentic path. Jung described this pattern as disturbing because such empathic individuals often developed what he called overused auxiliary functions that served others while neglecting their inner selves. When they finally chose their own needs, boundaries, and genuine self-expression, they didn't simply adjust. They underwent what Jung referred to as individuation acceleration, revealing either their capacity for psychological wholeness or the depth of self-neglect they had endured. What made this discovery so critical for Jung was that it marked a decisive moment in psychological evolution. The instant when patterns of accommodation either transform into conscious boundaries or collapse under the realization of how much authentic self had been sacrificed. Today, I'll reveal Jung's insights into what happens when the empath finally chooses themselves, and why he believed this decision either triggers authentic individuation or exposes the deep patterns of self-betrayal that people-pleasing had long concealed. The patient who vanished into themselves. Jung's breakthrough emerged while observing a patient with extraordinary sensitivity who had spent decades serving others while ignoring their own psychological needs. After years of therapy exploring these dynamics, the patient made what Jung called a choice, prioritizing their own well-being over the comfort of others for the first time. Within weeks, Jung witnessed something extraordinary. The patient's helpful, accommodating persona began to dissolve, revealing authentic personality aspects that had been buried for decades. Jung described this process as psychological metamorphosis. Like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon it had mistaken for its natural form, the patient began expressing repressed desires, asserting boundaries, and reclaiming forgotten interests. But this transformation caused what Jung termed relationship system collapse. Family members reacted with guilt trips and accusations of selfishness when their endless source of emotional labor suddenly disappeared. Jung realized this wasn't mere personal change. It was the exposure of how many relationships depend on one person's willingness to abandon themselves. The patient's decision revealed the exploitative underpinnings of relationships once seen as loving and supportive. What shocked Jung most was the predictability. He could foresee precisely how each family member would react to losing their accommodating provider, exposing the unconscious contracts that structured those relationships. This case taught Jung that choosing oneself often uncovers which connections were rooted in genuine care, and which demanded self-abandonment as the price of belonging. The psychology of accommodation. Jung found that empaths often develop what could be called psychological imbalance syndrome, an overdevelopment of their feeling function to serve others, while entirely neglecting their own emotional authenticity and growth. He identified three key components of this imbalance. External validation architecture. These individuals lose touch with their personal values, preferences, and boundaries because their sense of worth becomes fully dependent on external approval. Their psychological type becomes distorted. They read others expertly while remaining strangers to themselves. Shadow accumulation pressure. Jung observed that unmet needs don't vanish. They gather as shadow reserves. Authentic desires, boundaries, and healthy self-interest are pushed into the unconscious, creating internal tension that surfaces as depression, anxiety, or even physical symptoms. Compensatory individuation trigger. When empaths finally choose themselves, Jung observed a rapid psychological rebalancing. The psyche attempts to restore equilibrium by releasing years of suppressed personality traits into consciousness all at once. Jung noted that this is why choosing oneself feels so frightening. These individuals have been conditioned to equate their worth with constant self-sacrifice. You said. So, when empaths begin prioritizing their own needs, it triggers deep fears of abandonment and overwhelming guilt about being selfish. Once this internal system activates, they start uncovering forgotten aspects of themselves, often undergoing what Jung called personality archaeology, the excavation of long-buried parts of their authentic identity, the guilt weapon that destroys them. Jung identified why choosing themselves can feel psychologically devastating for empaths. They experience what could be called an empathic guilt complex, which can completely derail the individuation process. Jung observed three main guilt patterns that surface when empaths finally put themselves first. Betrayal guilt. They feel as though they're abandoning people who depend on them. Their new boundaries seem cruel, their self-care feels selfish, and their authentic self-expression appears to harm others. Identity guilt. Because their entire identity was built around accommodation, choosing themselves feels like becoming a different person, one who might lose their original essence. Worthiness guilt. Years of conditioning taught them that their value lies solely in being useful to others. So self-prioritization feels like claiming something they don't deserve. Jung noted that this guilt complex often drives empaths back into self-abandonment, simply because the psychological discomfort feels unbearable. They confuse guilt with conscience and mistake accommodation for love. What disturbed Jung most was how others consciously or unconsciously weaponize this guilt. When empaths start setting boundaries, those who benefited from their endless accommodation often escalate manipulation through guilt-inducing phrases like, "You've changed," or "You're being selfish." These tactics are designed to pull them back into self-sacrifice. Jung stressed that the only way to overcome this guilt is to recognize that self-abandonment is not virtue. It's harm, both to themselves and to others whose growth is stunted by dependence. If you've ever felt guilty for putting yourself first, remember, your worth isn't measured by your usefulness. The 4 transformation pathways. Jung outlined 4 distinct psychological paths empaths take when they begin choosing themselves, each representing a different outcome of this transformation. 1. The gradual boundary builder. These empaths awaken slowly, noticing their self-abandonment patterns and making small, consistent changes. Jung observed that they tend to maintain more relationships since the shift feels less threatening to others, but they also face constant pressure from people hoping it's just a phase. Their key breakthrough is developing conscious accommodation, learning to choose when to help instead of automatically sacrificing themselves. This creates healthier relationships while preserving their empathic core. 2. The crisis catalyst. This type experiences dramatic transformation triggered by a specific event that forces them to choose between self-abandonment and psychological survival. Jung described this as persona collapse, a sudden breakdown of the people-pleasing identity once accommodation becomes unbearable. Crisis catalysts endure more relational chaos, but they achieve deeper transformation because returning to old patterns becomes impossible without deliberate regression. 3. The boundary specialist. These empaths dedicate themselves to mastering what Jung called psychological boundary discernment, the ability to separate their emotions from others, their needs from others' expectations, and their values from others' projections. They maintain emotional sensitivity while preserving inner stability. They learn to feel others' emotions without absorbing them, and to offer support without self-erasure. 4. The authentic integrator. This was Jung's most advanced category, the empath who achieves true integration. They embody genuine empathic power, fully themselves, yet deeply connected to others. They honor both their emotional sensitivity and individuality simultaneously. These individuals often report feeling more empathic than ever because they're no longer drained by unconscious self-sacrifice. Their compassion becomes sustainable, renewed by awareness rather than compulsion. The dangerous transition risks. Jung identified several psychological dangers that make self-choosing one of the hardest stages in human growth. Identity dissolution terror. Many empaths experience ego collapse once they stop defining themselves through service. Since their identity was entirely built on self-sacrifice, choosing themselves triggers existential panic, forcing them to question who they are without those familiar, accommodating roles. This crisis can become so severe that some retreat into self-abandonment, convincing themselves that self-care is selfishness just to escape the discomfort of growth. Social system earthquake. Jung observed that once empaths stop accommodating, their relational ecosystems often fall apart. Those who depended on their constant availability respond with manipulation, guilt, or outright rejection instead of adapting to healthier boundaries. Jung observed that many empaths lose significant relationships during their transformation, not because they become cruel, but because so many of their previous connections were built on subtle exploitation rather than genuine care. Guilt, overwhelm, and paralysis. The guilt complex can grow so intense that it disrupts psychological stability altogether. Jung documented cases where empaths experienced what he called moral injury, the feeling that they had violated their deepest values simply by setting boundaries. Without adequate support, this guilt often drives them back into self-abandonment or manifests as severe anxiety and depression. Overcorrection extremes. Jung also warned of another danger: the swing from total self-abandonment to defensive selfishness. Some empaths become so protective of themselves that they suppress their natural sensitivity, mistaking isolation for empowerment. This overcorrection, Jung noted, often arises from unprocessed anger at years of being used. While that anger is valid and even necessary, if it becomes the main emotional driver, empaths risk losing the very essence of their authentic empathy. Jung's empathic individuation method. To help empaths reclaim themselves without losing their innate sensitivity, Jung developed a structured approach that balanced self-prioritization with emotional connection. 1. Shadow Integration Protocol. Jung believed empaths must acknowledge the disowned aspects of themselves, the parts they suppress to maintain their accommodating identity. These include healthy selfishness, justified anger, authentic desires, and real boundaries. He designed specific practices to aid this process: documenting moments of self-suppression for others' comfort, identifying childhood conditioning that linked worth to usefulness, and practicing authentic expression in low-stakes settings to build confidence. Jung stressed that shadow integration is not about becoming selfish, but about realizing that genuine self-care benefits everyone. When empaths neglect their needs, they become drained and resentful, diminishing their true empathic capacity. 2. Conscious boundary architecture. Jung taught empaths to differentiate between empathy and absorption, helping and enabling, compassion and codependency, a process he called empathic discernment training. His practical protocols included declining requests without lengthy justification, identifying guilt-based manipulation tactics, developing emotional filters that allow sincere connection but block psychological exploitation. Jung emphasized that boundaries aren't walls but selective membranes. They preserve empathy by preventing the exhaustion that leads to emotional shutdown. 3. Authentic voice recovery. Jung also recognized that empaths require systematic practice to recover their authentic voice after years of silencing themselves. This involves reconnecting with personal values, preferences, and emotions buried under chronic accommodation. Recommended methods included regular self-reflection to identify genuine feelings, creative expression as a bridge to unconscious material, gradual sharing of authentic thoughts within safe, supportive relationships to rebuild confidence. 4. Relationship reconstruction standards. Finally, Jung urged empaths to rebuild connections founded on mutual respect and emotional reciprocity rather than one-sided giving. This meant conducting relationship audits, assessing which bonds were nurturing and which were exploitative. He developed clear criteria for healthy relationships: mutual emotional support, respect for personal boundaries, appreciation without expectation of endless availability, encouragement of individual growth over dependency, success and failure case studies. Jung's analysis revealed distinct patterns separating successful empathic individuation from destructive overcorrection. Success model: Carl Rogers. Jung would have recognized Carl Rogers as an empath who mastered self-prioritization while deepening his empathic abilities. Rogers developed professional empathy, feeling deeply for his clients while maintaining firm therapeutic boundaries that safeguarded both parties. His breakthrough insight was that unlimited emotional access destroys both the helper and the helped. By channeling empathy through structured, contained contexts, Rogers transformed sensitivity into a tool for genuine healing rather than dependency. Jung viewed this as proof that choosing oneself enhances, rather than diminishes, authentic empathy. Success model: Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt's evolution from a self-effacing, accommodating wife into an independent social leader exemplified successful empathic individuation. She redirected her emotional sensitivity toward social justice, finding purpose in causes that honored her empathy without requiring personal self-erasure. Jung would have seen her transformation as the ideal integration of empathy, strength, and individuality, a model of what it means to care deeply without losing oneself. Roosevelt's evolution illustrates how empaths can redirect their sensitivity toward collective healing while preserving strong personal boundaries, proving that empathy and self-respect are not opposites but mutually reinforcing powers. Failure pattern: the defensive shutdown. Jung documented a recurring failure mode among empaths who shifted from chronic accommodation to complete emotional withdrawal. He called this reaction empathy phobia, the fear that any expression of sensitivity will lead back to exploitation. While this defense mechanism protects them from further harm, It also severs them from vital parts of their own nature. These individuals often describe feeling emotionally hollow because, in rejecting harmful self-abandonment, they also rejected their innate capacity for empathy. Failure pattern. The guilt recycler. Another destructive pattern Jung identified was what he termed the guilt recycling loop. These empaths alternate between setting boundaries and retreating into accommodation whenever the discomfort of guilt becomes unbearable. Each cycle reinforces the belief that self-prioritization equals selfishness. This repeating pattern persists when empaths lack proper guidance and mistake conditioned guilt for genuine moral conscience. Critical success elements. Jung's analysis revealed that successful empathic transformation depends on several key conditions. Reliable support systems during the transition. Understanding that empathy and boundaries can coexist harmoniously. Emphasis on gradual practice rather than extreme behavioral swings. Recognition that healthy relationships flourish when both sides honor personal boundaries. Building empathy through protective communities. Jung recognized that empaths require specific relational strategies to preserve emotional health while maintaining their commitment to self-prioritization. Healthy relationship recognition. He outlined several signs that indicate whether someone can sustain a relationship with an individuated empath. They appreciate empathy without exploiting it. They maintain emotional self-regulation instead of demanding constant reassurance. They respect boundaries without personal offense. They practice reciprocal empathy, showing genuine concern for the empath's well-being. Healthy individuals, Jung noted, support empathic boundary development rather than perceiving it as withdrawal. They interpret empathic self-care as growth, not rejection. Empathy-honoring communities. Jung encouraged empaths to seek out relationships with people who understand that sensitivity must be protected to remain sustainable. These are individuals who balance compassion with self-respect, value psychological development, and don't demand emotional self-sacrifice as proof of love. He emphasized joining communities where sensitivity is valued but not exploited. Emotional intelligence is appreciated but not endlessly demanded. Personal growth is encouraged rather than feared. Predator recognition protocols. Jung also warned about those who deliberately target empathic people for emotional exploitation. Common warning signs include sharing dramatic personal stories early to elicit rescuing behavior, repeatedly crossing boundaries while pretending ignorance, reacting to limits with guilt or anger, displaying selective empathy, caring only when it benefits them. He noted that manipulators often use lines like, "You're the only one who understands me," to create false emotional intimacy and ensnare empathic individuals in exploitative dynamics. Relationship evolution strategies. Jung developed practical approaches for rebuilding or reshaping relationships after self-prioritization, communicating clearly about personal changes being made, maintaining consistent boundaries despite resistance, educating others on the difference between empathy and enabling, performing relationship graduations, evaluating whether a connection can evolve toward mutual respect or should naturally end. The complete transformation journey. Jung documented the predictable inner stages empaths experience as they move toward authentic individuation, a process of growth, not a personality defect. 1. Recognition shock phase. Empaths become aware of how deeply their accommodation patterns have cost them, often feeling pattern shock, grief for the authentic self they had abandoned. Jung viewed this grief as a healthy step, mourning the years of suppressed individuality. 2. Boundary experimentation stage. Here, empaths begin small acts of self-prioritization, saying no to unreasonable requests, voicing genuine opinions, and taking personal time without guilt. This phase often provokes strong pushback from those accustomed to their constant availability. 3. Authentic integration period. Jung identified this as the stage when empaths learn to honor both their sensitivity and individuality simultaneously. They practice conscious empathy, engaging with others intentionally rather than reflexively. Most describe feeling more alive and genuine than ever before, finally expressing their repressed personality traits while preserving emotional attunement. 4. Relationship revolution era. Individuated empaths begin attracting entirely new relational dynamics. They draw people who appreciate authenticity instead of exploiting accommodation. Old connections either evolve into mutual respect or fade away naturally. Jung noted that these empaths often become silent teachers, living proof that empathy and boundaries can coexist, and that self-respect enhances true connection. 5. Empathic mastery achievement. At this highest stage, empaths integrate sensitivity with solid self-prioritization. They connect deeply without losing themselves, offer help without enabling dependency, and stay emotionally available without exhaustion. Many discover purpose in guiding others through similar transformations, turning personal evolution into service that honors both empathy and individuation. If you've started rediscovering forgotten parts of yourself, remember the affirmation, "I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be." Integration, roadblocks, and solutions. Jung identified several psychological traps that can derail empaths during transformation, warning especially against one he called the extreme swing trap. Jung warned that empaths moving from full accommodation to emotional hardness risk losing their empathic nature entirely. This comes from unprocessed anger over past exploitation. Jung's solution involved gradual empathy, slowly reintroducing emotional engagement in safe spaces instead of swinging between absorption and total shutdown. The guilt relapse cycle. Many empaths fall back into accommodation when self-prioritization guilt becomes too strong, creating cycles of boundary attempts followed by guilt-driven self-sacrifice. Jung addressed this through guilt tolerance, understanding that guilt around self-care doesn't make it wrong, but shows how deeply the empath was conditioned to put others first. The isolation reaction. Jung warned about empaths withdrawing from all connection instead of building boundaried relationships. While solitude helps self-discovery, complete isolation blocks healthy relational growth. He recommended selective engagement, keeping contact with emotionally healthy people while setting firm limits with exploitative ones rather than avoiding everyone. The surface change illusion. Jung noted some empaths adopt boundary talk without changing their inner patterns. They set outer limits but still prioritize others' comfort over their own authenticity. Jung emphasized that true transformation happens within, changing self-relationship, not just managing others' behavior. The cultural impact. Jung believed empaths choosing themselves play a vital role in collective psychological growth, modeling healthier relationship patterns and challenging society's exploitation of sensitivity. He observed that empaths often carry collective emotional labor, absorbing what others refuse to face. When they stop doing so, it forces communities toward maturity. Relationship evolution modeling. Individuated empaths show that sensitivity and strength coexist, disproving that empathy requires self-sacrifice. Their example gives others permission to honor empathy while keeping boundaries. Communities with individuated empaths develop greater emotional intelligence because they no longer depend on empaths' endless accommodation. Social system transformation. When empaths choose themselves, they trigger evolution within their social circles. Exploitative ties dissolve, while genuine ones adapt to respect empathic needs. Though disruptive at first, this process creates healthier dynamics overall. As people learn, love doesn't need self-abandonment to exist. Conscious evolution contribution. Jung believed empaths who balance sensitivity with self-respect contribute to humanity's individuation, authentic, conscious relationship growth. Individuated empaths become pioneers, proving that emotional depth and boundaries strengthen genuine connection, modeling evolved human relating. The return to wholeness. When empaths finally choose themselves, they achieve psychological completeness. Jung's research shows this shift transforms empathy from unconscious absorption into conscious compassion, from compulsive accommodation into genuine care. When empaths meet their own needs first, they realize sensitivity was never the issue, the lack of boundaries was. Empathy without self-respect turns enabling. Empathy with boundaries becomes healing. This transformation isn't selfishness, it's wholeness. Empaths who choose themselves don't lose connection. They gain authentic connection beyond savior-victim patterns. Your empathy isn't a flaw to fix, but a gift to protect. Jung showed that sensitivity with self-respect creates mutual empathy instead of one-sided sacrifice. Choosing yourself isn't rejecting empathy, it's integrating it, letting it serve healing, growth, and real love instead of codependence. Jung concluded that individuated empaths become beacons of possibility, proving that deep feeling and firm boundaries can coexist, that empathy and self-care strengthen each other, and that choosing yourself is often the most empathic act of all. If you've finally chosen yourself after years of choosing everyone else, comment, I honor my empathy by protecting it. Your shift from unconscious accommodation to conscious compassion is what Jung called individuation, becoming who you were always meant to be. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.